All right, we are recording. Welcome everybody to the USDA Technical Assistance Food Safety Outreach Grant. This grant is a collaboration of Texas Tech University, Alabama A&M University, and Iowa State University, and it's titled Empowering Minority Serving Institutions Food Safety Specialists to Write Successful Food Safety Outreach Grant Proposals through Education, Training, and Technical Assistance. We are here to support both minority serving institutions as well as those that are collaborating with minority serving institutions, but we welcome everybody in this space. So this is our team on our grant. We have myself, Angela Shaw, Texas Tech University. We have Armicha Jackson at Alabama A&M University. We have Shannon Coleman, who is online with us today at Iowa State University. And we have Christine Strom, who is our grant writer to the stars with engineering science editors. And we have a guest speaker today. We have Naomi. She is one of our grant specialists. She's a research administrator in our Office of Research Services, or like I say, the person that helps me get my grant submitted. So she is here to answer all questions related to budgets, budget justifications, but honestly, she does all the submissions, so she could probably answer a lot of questions on the submission of grants. Our agenda today, we are going to talk about the required forms related to budget and budget justification. What does the RFP say about budget and budget justification? The evaluation criteria, components of the budget, best practices, and we will have time for questions. As always, we're going to turn off our camera to help with bandwidth. So what are the required forms? Well, under the grants for the Food Safety Outreach Grant, the SF 424 R&R family of forms. So this is where you find all the cover sheets, the project performance site locations, and a whole host of forms that are going to be required. You are also required to submit the project summary, the project narrative, the bio sketch, or the senior key personnel profiles, the budget and budget justification, the data management plan, as well as the conflict of interest list. When we talk about the budget and the budget justification, the R&R budget form that is located in the NIFA Grant Application Guide, I have a picture of what that is, and you will get a link to where that you can find that is part of the requirements in that SF 424 family series. In this grant, there's no match required, and NIFA says that that will not factor into the review criteria. So if you have match, it's not going to give you bonus points under this RFP. That is different depending upon what grant series it is. When we talk about the RFP, also, we have instructions about the indirect costs, that it's not to exceed 30% of the total federal funds awarded, or whatever rate that your institution or has established for your IDC rate. So I want to stop a moment because I got a question for Naomi. Related to indirect costs, are there any best practices you would have in place, or any guidance you would have for anybody who's present?
Yes. So the first thing I always ask my PIs for is the guidelines, and that is to go over the indirect costs, because we have the indirect cost rate is because we have, everyone has their own rate that they follow. However, the guidelines they're going to oversee that. And so we always want to look at the guidelines first to make sure we're using the rate that we are supposed to be using. And yes, USDA always has that exception here. And this is what we follow as well.
Wonderful. So the take-home message is, for whatever institution or institute you're going to be submitting for, it's important to understand if you have to use a 30% or if you have a negotiated rate for your entity.
Yes.
So this is the guidance that they talk about for the grant application. One thing that I know is this updates on a regular basis. And so it's important for you to go in and as you're thinking about a submission of your grants through the NIFA system, that you are making sure you have the latest guide on how to submit your grant, how to develop your application, any specific instructions and forms, because those forms do change on a regular basis, and any additional guidelines related to that. Naomi, do you have any comments related to this guide that USDA NIFA puts out every couple months sometimes?
No, you kind of hit on hit it right on, saying that stuff changes. And so you always want to be sure that you have the most current one in front of you, because if you do all the work and you find out later that it's changed, that's just unfortunate. And so you always want to make sure that you are looking at the current one and looking at the correct program.
So when we talk about budget and the budget justification, the number one thing that I emphasize for any PIs is making sure that whatever you write within your budget aligns with your work plan. We talked about in a previous section that the importance of making sure that your logic model with your outputs, your outcomes, your personnel align, so that if you're proposing to for someone to do a lot of work, the expectation is that you're paying for some of their time. Or if you're giving workshops, that you have some budget in there that have that. So within the evaluation plan, which I'll go through, there are specific questions that the evaluators will need to go over related to your budget. But it's a line by line list of all your expenses and a general description of what you're going to do. You should have informed estimates and accurate quotations, and always think about how prices might change between the time you submit and the time you might be needing to do things. And the area I always think about is travel. Things are getting more and more expensive, so you need to be really realistic and consistent. Now, I talked about the evaluation criteria, and you can find this information between pages 21 and 26 of this RFP for the USDA Food Safety Outreach Grant. And they have a section that's called Budget and Budget Justification, part of their criteria. So when we talk about the community outreach projects, which is one of the 3 categories you may go into, it talks about making sure that there's adequate support of activities that are consistent with the proposed objectives. So that's really making sure, again, that project outline is accurate, that they've incorporated innovative approaches using within their local communities, as well as the support for developing and implementing new criteria. So it's important that, again, you put money in there if you're going to be developing videos or developing handouts, that you've adequately put things in for that. And that you've had some allowance and justification for any key personnel, management, and support. So one thing that I've heard a lot about is, if all your budget is personnel, then maybe that's appropriate, maybe it's not, based on your grant proposal. Similar language you can see for the collaborative education and training projects. You can find those details on the RP page 22, have the same wording of what the evaluators of your grant have to score. So they will do a score based on the appropriateness. When we go into the regional centers and the lead regional centers, there's additional wording in here because they really want to emphasize, are you utilizing what's currently out there? And saying maybe you're going to modify it for your project, or are you able to, or do you need to develop new things? So the wording changes slightly in the evaluation criteria, but the wording is basically the same, making sure you're consistent with your work plan. When you talk about the components of a budget, I'm going to go through these, what the definitions are, but I'm going to lean on Naomi to kind of talk us through some of the things she's seen over her many years of doing budgets from PIs. So the categories are personnel, travel and equipment, participant support cost, other direct costs, and then these F&A rates within your budget. These components need to be for both the lead institution as well as subcontracting institutions. So you need to have a main budget, but if you have some subcontractors, they are to list out all of these categories. So the budget justification is a category or description of the cost. I'm going to explain staffing, supplies, the patterns, estimates of media. It takes into account inflation rates and the total budget per category. It includes things like salaries, fringe benefits, equipment, travel, and other indirect and direct costs that may be associated with your grant. So we go into those specific components. So you may say, we don't need to pay personnel. Well, you still need to have these on your budget justification. And you need to say none, apply for a specific category. So for key personnel, you should have the key person's name, their title, the time that they're going to be contributing to the project, and an explanation of their role for the project. That's similar to other personnel, things like postdocs, graduate assistants, undergraduates, other people that you might be hiring, or indicate if you need to hire somebody for a position. And again, the title, the time they're going to contribute, and explain their role. Fringe benefits, most of this pertains to if you are a university, and these rates typically are different for faculty, staff, and students, as well as the insurance rates might be different for faculty, staff, and students. So you need to put those within your budget justification. Any equipment that's over $5,000 over 1 year needs to be listed and justified. And then with travel, identifying the purpose, that destination, the dates of the travel, if possible, the number of individuals per trip, an estimate on the length of trip. Are you going to need airfare? Are you going to need transportation? Is there registration costs? All of these need to be in detail. Naomi, within these categories, what have you seen?
What I see over and over again is just not enough information, not enough justification for what you're using on the project. And so if you have, let's say, for example, you have a piece of equipment that you're going to use, you really need to justify why you're using that. Why are you using that equipment? Don't just list the equipment and say how much it is. You really need to go into depth more on stuff that you're going to be using. So I can't say that enough. It's just the lack of justification that I see over and over again, because the reviewers, they can see the budget, they can see that you want the $6,000 for this equipment, but why? What is it going to be used for? How is it going to be used? So you always want to ask yourself, how and why over and over through the justification.
I love that. And really related to the role of people, I commonly see that where they list out people and the time, but they don't say, are they part of a specific objective? Are they part of, what is their role of the project? So you justify that you need a month of their time, or they're going to be full-time on the grant. What are their role? And then with travel, I see a lot of times you may not know the specific destination, but you need to have some kind of estimate of how much things are going to cost. One category that I asked Naomi to give us a little bit more detail on is this participant or training support costs. So these are participants that are participating in your project, and it could be associated with conferences, workshops, symposiums, who are not employees of the applicant or subawards.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit more detail about what this category is and how it's used?
I can. And so one thing that I use in my own personal thought process in determining whether a fund is requested for participant support cost or human subject cost. And the main thing is, are you gathering data from that person? If you send a participant to a workshop and strictly just ask them to participate in that workshop, you're not and you don't gather any data, that would be that you could categorize that under participant support costs. But if you gather data, that's a human subject cost. And so you just have to be careful between those two things about how do you categorize that.
So is there anything, I know that a lot of people like the participant cost because there's no indirects associated with it. So is
That's
that
correct.
one of the main big differences, whether it goes under an other direct cost, which would be like an honorarium where you have to put indirect costs, versus, are there any other differences between being a participant cost or being in the other category?
Um, yes, you're right. The honorarium would not go under participant support costs because it's almost like you're paying this person a fee. It's like they are an employee, in quotations, not really, but you're paying them to be the guest speaker at a conference or a workshop or so forth and so forth. And so anything that kind of goes as to employee type thing is not going to be considered participant support costs. And yes, going back to your question about the FNA, we always have to make sure it meets that eligibility, because you don't count the FNA towards a participant support cost. So we just have to make sure it's okay to go forward with the accounting.
Thank you. So then we have this other category of other direct costs. And so if you have any materials or supplies or equipment that's under 5,000, then they need to be listed out, and justification of how you came up with that amount and what is it going to be used for. So we have materials and supplies, like if you're doing a workshop and you're having to buy things, or if you're doing analysis and you need to buy things. Another category under direct costs is publishing costs. So if you are going to do a peer reviewed journal article and you want to do open access to that journal article, then you put it under here. Computer services. So I think about if you need to buy a piece of software for your computer, or you're buying a computer because you're going to help somebody do a food safety plan. That's where the computer services come in. Are there any other things that you could think of, Naomi, that might go under these three categories?
Not so much those three, but under other direct costs, I see a lot of times rental equipment or rental space of a lab, stuff like that you might need, that would go under other direct costs as well.
Yeah, rental of like greenhouse space or meeting
Yes.
space is
Yes.
another, it really a good place that you have that.
Yes.
Other direct costs are things like consultation services, where a consultant is providing a service for you, or a vendor. And then you have your subawards that are carrying out an aspect of the work. And sometimes I get a lot of questions of, what is the difference between if somebody can be considered a service or they have to be a subaward? Naomi, do you have any insight on the differences if somebody's thinking about putting people under each of these categories?
Yes, and so with the subaward, if you're going to use a subaward versus a consultant, you wouldn't be able to, the subaward, the institution wouldn't be able to claim or request any funds for materials or travel or anything along that line. It's strictly a payment. If you're using it as a consultant service, you're using that payment just as for consulting fees. not for travel, not for anything else like that. And so if you do categorize, if you do have a subaward and you categorize them as a subaward, they will have to take out the F&A costs. It's just a main budget, like the whole thing will be used as a subaward instead of a consultation.
I love that. So other direct costs, we talked about equipment rental, facility fees, things like they're not allowed for this project, but if you're trying to do any renovations or anything in that category, but again, that's not allowed for most projects. And especially this call, you cannot request any of those. Tuition is another category for graduate students that I commonly see in the budget, and people list those out specifically, how much the cost is for tuition, how much time for the grant. And then other areas is needed. We talked about honorariums might be in there, and there might be other things that you want to request that do not fall in these kind of standard categories within that. And then we have the indirect costs that you need to include part of your budget. Naomi, do you have anything additional you would add to the components of the budget?
Not at this time. No, ma'am.
So when we talk about best practices, I think I've said this multiple times already. Make sure you check with your unit or institution to determine what format they want you to use. Make sure that you take into account the rising costs in budgets, and make sure you're aligned with your work plan, what your outputs are, what your outcomes are, what your personnel are on the budget, and provide enough detail for the evaluators to answer those evaluation questions that are written out in the RFP. And I've highlighted in this webinar the specific pages. Making sure that you have informed estimates and adequate quotations for any of the charges, and be really realistic and consistent, because I've been on many of these grant panels and I'm like, they don't need that much for what they're requesting. So really make sure that you describe why you're asking for how much you're asking for. So that is all the information we're providing just right now. And I would turn it over to Naomi to provide us with any additional things she might have as advice as people are putting together their budget and their budget justification.
Yeah, so initially I would say to always contact your sponsored project office. They can at least help you with the basics of what is the limit on the budget that you need, and what is the F&A rate, and what is absolutely not allowed or allowed, because some programs don't allow tuition on the budget. And so that would be my number one advice, is to just contact your sponsored office project before you get started on the budget, just to make sure that you have all those limitations in place.
I love it. Yeah, I always am reaching out like, is this right? Is my current salary rate right? Am I estimating right? Just to make sure that I'm being consistent and I have enough details and it makes sense. And it's always good to have a second eye on things.
Oh, yes, always.
So we have some webinars that have been recorded, and we just want to, before we get into the question and answer, that's our next session. So make sure that you get your questions that you might have for us, and put those in our Q&A section so that we can start answering those for you. But we've had some wonderful webinars that are posted on our website related to how to extract information from your proposal, first page, how to do a work plan, how to highlight innovation and uniqueness, thinking about meaningful stakeholder involvement, logic models, learning from rejection, and today we are recording our budget and budget justification. Just a reminder, we do have our office consultation hours, And you can sign up, and we'll have that link after the webinar to sign up to meet with us for an hour for us to listen to your ideas, provide you with feedback. We are also here to look at written materials and help as you're drafting your next USDA FSOP grant. In May, we will have another webinar series, and this will be our general USDA grant series. So the past series we've been doing have been focused on the USDA Food Safety Outreach grant call, but these are going to be talking about those grant calls that include research, that include education, and really dive into what grants are available and get into more details as you talk about not just extension and outreach. So we hope you join us for those webinars, and they will all be recorded. In addition to this, we will be launching our summer boot camp. We want to make you better grant writers. And so we are going to have a 3-phase summer boot camp where we're going to be educating on a component, allowing you to work on it, give you work time, and then provide feedback. So we welcome if you have some grants that you wanted to read that got rejected or you're still working through and they're not just FSOP, for you to come and be part of our summer boot camp. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we're going to open it up. We're going to turn back on our cameras and open it up for any questions that you have.